Bienvenidos nuevamente. Si les parece, vamos a dar entonces inicio a la sesión de la tarde, a los paneles de la tarde. El tercer panel que vamos a escuchar ahora es sobre seguridad nuclear, estrategias de prevención del terrorismo nuclear y del tráfico ilícito de materiales y de tecnología. Este panel está moderado por Joan Rolfing, quien es desde 2010 presidenta y directora de operaciones del Nuclear Threat Initiative de Estados Unidos. Es responsable de la gestión de todos los programas y operaciones de NTI. Codirige la Secretaría del Nuclear Security Project, que es un esfuerzo por impulsar la acción global para reducir los peligros nucleares inminentes. En el corriente año ha sido nombrada miembro del Consejo Asesor del Secretario de Industria de Estados Unidos y participa de las cumbres de seguridad nuclear como asesora en la Cumbre de la Industria. Anteriormente se desempeñó en el Departamento de Energía. Los expositores incluyen, en primer lugar, a Kearns, del Reino Unido, director del European Leadership Network. Anteriormente fue vicedirector del Institute for Public Policy Research. Se desempeñó como asesor especialista de la Cámara de los Comunes y Cámara de los Lores en el Comité de Estrategia de Seguridad Nacional. Fue director del programa de posgrado en estudios internacionales de la Universidad de Sheffield. En segundo lugar, Rhonda Evans, de la División de Seguridad Nuclear del Organismo Internacional de Energía Atómica, o Iaea. Graduada en leyes por la Universidad de Sydney, se ocupa en el Iaea de asesorar a los Estados miembros en cuanto a las series de seguridad nuclear y conduce sesiones de entrenamiento y misiones de revisión entre pares. Antes de su posición actual, ejerció funciones en el Gobierno Federal de Australia, principalmente en la Agencia Australiana de Radioprotección y Seguridad Nuclear. Finalmente, Gustavo Enchil, quien es director de Seguridad Internacional, Asuntos Nucleares y Espaciales, DIGAN, del Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores. Es diplomático de carrera con el rango de embajador. Estuvo destinado en la misión argentina para el desarme, en la Embajada Argentina en la República Oriental del Uruguay y en la misión permanente de la República Argentina ante las Naciones Unidas. Actualmente se desempeña como Sherpa por la Argentina en el proceso de las cumbres de seguridad nuclear. Doy entonces la palabra a Joan como moderadora.
So thank you very much for that kind introduction. I am going to take a few minutes to do a little bit of a scene setter for this session on nuclear materials security. And I'm going to start back at the beginning, which is why should we care about nuclear materials security? What is the threat? Most of you are already familiar with this, but the reason we're concerned about materials security is that terrorists, okay, we're having a little bit of a technical issue with the slides. Terrorists have stated their desire to try and acquire the material or a weapon. We know that Al-Qaeda has stated that acquiring nuclear weapons is a religious duty. We also know that there are approximately 2,000 tons of weapons-usable materials around the world, plutonium and highly enriched uranium. Many of those materials at sites that are inadequately secured. The international community is still not properly organized to address this deficit. And I think it goes without saying that we're only as strong as the weakest link. So let's focus on what we can do as an international community to try and improve materials security. One of the significant challenges we have today is that there is no effective global system for securing these materials. While there are many existing agreements, guidelines, and multilateral mechanisms, they fall short. There are no binding international standards. There are guidelines, some excellent guidelines published by the Iaea, but they are not binding, nor do they cover all nuclear materials. They cover only civilian nuclear materials around the world. There's also not an accountability mechanism. While the Iaea does have safeguards inspections, that's really to account for and to count material at sites. It's not to look at the security of those sites. In the context of the nuclear security summits, And there have been 3 summits now, with a 4th one scheduled for 2016. There's been some very good international dialogue among quite a few of the Sherpas. And one of the innovations that has come out of that dialogue, and in some ways these points have made their way into the communique, there's growing consensus around what the key elements of a global nuclear materials security system should look like. And it essentially boils down to these 4 principles. The first principle, that all nuclear weapons materials should be covered, not just civilian materials, but military materials as well, which comprise approximately 85% of the weapons usable materials in the world. The second principle is that all states should adhere to international standards and best practices. It's time for us, rather than having an ad hoc approach where each state follows its own version of security, where we have some standardization and where we find ways to share best practices with each other. The third principle is that states need to help build confidence in the effectiveness of their security practices by taking reassuring actions, confidence-building actions, to demonstrate that their materials really are secure. It's no longer good enough to continue to tell each other, don't worry about it, I've got it covered, my material is secure. The fourth and final principle is that states need to work to reduce this risk over time by minimizing, or where feasible, eliminating these materials and the locations, the number of locations where they are found. This is an ongoing process, but one where we've had some success, especially with respect to highly enriched uranium. So I want to drill down on just a few of these principles. I want to talk about military materials just for a moment to share some information that is not widely understood. As I mentioned earlier, military materials comprise 85% of the global stocks of weapons-usable nuclear materials. Now, some people have said that the nuclear security summits actually don't cover these military materials at all, and we were encouraged to see that now in several of the communiques at the Nuclear Security Summit, there is broad language that says that it's the responsibility of states to maintain effective security of all nuclear and other radioactive materials, including nuclear materials used in nuclear weapons. This is a really important concept for states to have embraced in the context of the summit. The next challenge, however, is working on creating some mechanisms and some security standards and some transparency around those military materials, because those do not yet exist. Just wanted to share a pie chart with you showing, again, the global percentages, and this one in a little bit more detail. There's a popular misconception that we cannot work together on the security of military materials because those materials are far too sensitive. In fact, there's an assumption that those materials are all classified. And what this chart demonstrates is that of all of that 85% of the pie, approximately 23% of the material is in warhead form, either in active warheads or retired warheads. The vast majority of materials is in different and less sensitive forms. In the naval fuel cycle, or the reserve of highly enriched uranium set aside for naval fuel, a good portion of that in the US. It's in this big purple block at the bottom, the 43% of material that is in bulk form at bulk processing facilities. Some of that is for research. Some of it is weapons components that are in the process of being dismantled and dispositioned. And then there's 11% that the US and Russia have, between the two of them, declared excess to military purposes. I would maintain that there are some good opportunities within these other pie wedges to try and develop some transparency measures to build confidence in the status of those materials. The other point I wanted to talk briefly about was the issue of reducing and eliminating nuclear materials. Many of you are familiar with the the excellent work that's been done over the last several decades at removing highly enriched uranium from sites around the world. There's a great track record there. We have we've removed some very small amounts of plutonium, but from many different states, from more than 25 states, we have removed highly enriched uranium and eliminated it entirely from those countries. And so we've literally cut in half the number of countries that possess highly enriched uranium and plutonium as a result of that process. However, this process has been almost exclusively focused on highly enriched uranium to date, and almost exclusively focused on highly enriched uranium in the civilian sphere. And you can see that on the left-hand side of the graph. It's representing the amount of HEU stockpiled in the world, approximately 1,500 metric tons. That narrow blue wedge is where we've made such good progress in the last few years. So you can see there's so much more to do. I also want to draw your attention to the right side of the slide, however, because this is an untold story, and it's an area where we need to work much harder as a community. You see that the stockpiles of plutonium are smaller overall, global stockpiles just below 500 metric tons. However, a much larger percentage, that blue wedge shows you the percentage in the civil sector. And you can see underneath the number of bomb equivalents that this plutonium represents compared to the number of bomb equivalents that the HEU represents. And so this is just a way of saying that even though we've made great progress on HEU, we have so much further to go. We really need to work on creating some standards and mechanisms for addressing the plutonium as well, because as the HEU inventories are coming down, fortunately, our plutonium inventories are continuing to grow. And this is because we're producing and separating for the civilian stockpile. So that brings me to a final scene setter slide, which is what do we need to do as we head into the 2016 summit? And I list here 5 priorities that have been developed by a collective number of voices, both outside and inside of government, through the Fissile Material Working Group, through the Nuclear Security Governance Group, and also through the Global Dialogue, which is a process that NTI has been leading. And what's interesting to me is even though there are these multiple processes underway, there is a high degree of convergence about what our opportunities are for the 2016 summit. So, you know, these mirror very closely the 4 principles of an effective nuclear security system that we talked about a little bit earlier. Point 1, make the regime comprehensive, cover all materials. Point 2, share information, find ways to build confidence through transparency measures, through declarations. Number 3, work on implementing best practices and standards, and this requires that we first create a set of standards. Number 4, offer plans for what we talked about in the last graphic, for eliminating civil HEU and reducing plutonium, and I would add for weapons-usable HEU as well. And finally, create a sustainable mechanism for continued progress. It's really essential as we reach what everyone expects to be the end of this summit process, that we find a way to continue a high-level dialogue on these critical issues so that we can make progress, because this agenda will not be done. We're not going to complete this by 2016. So let me stop with that, and we'll turn to our next speaker, Ian Kearns, and move on from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Joan. Let me start by saying that I agree with all of that, every word of it. I'd like to make 5 points, additional points, which I think are a little more overtly political in terms of how we think about the challenge. The first is, and as Joan just said at the end of her remarks, everyone expects the next summit in 2016 to be the last summit. That's something that I find very concerning. As the director of an organization which has, in the recent weeks, mobilized a large group of European leaders to intervene in the Ebola crisis in West Africa. As a network, we thought it was crucial to say that there needed to be a leadership-level engagement on the Ebola crisis, at summit level. And it seems to me that it's difficult to tell the world, on the one hand, that this is a crucial challenge and that we need to do much more to address it, and on the other hand, for everyone to accept that leaders will no longer engage in a summit-level process. And I understand there are reasons why the dialogue has moved in this direction, but for me, it's a bad signal to send. And I think the only reason why there shouldn't continue to be summits post-2016 is a lack of direct political will, and I think that should be challenged. So that's the first point I would want to make. The second is that I think we need to keep working at broadening the participation in the summit process itself. In 2016, there are only, I think, 53 countries who took part in the last summit out of 190 plus states that could have taken part in terms of UN members. Some important states are missing, countries like Belarus, Uzbekistan, even Iran. And here I think there's a political challenge in the sense that and I guess a challenge in the US government as well as anywhere else, that the nuclear security issue specialists, I think, need to be talking a lot more to the regional security specialists and to the country specialists about how you can bring some of these players to the table. I attended a meeting with a delegation of government officials from Belarus in London just a week ago, and it was very clear to me that in general geopolitical terms, Belarus is thinking about how it can avoid becoming a battleground between Russia and the West. It's thinking about its geopolitical position. I think there are opportunities in terms of engaging a country like Belarus, linking this issue to other issues to give them something they want in order to encourage them to engage more in this area where we'd like them to engage. One could say the same thing, of course, about Iran. This could be part of a much bigger package of changes which take place in the relationship with Iran if a nuclear deal can be both agreed and successfully ratified and implemented. Now, I understand these challenges are extremely difficult and complex. All I'm suggesting is that there are opportunities, there are political opportunities due to things which aren't necessarily to do with the nuclear security agenda narrowly defined, but which give us an opportunity to broaden participation in the summit process moving forward. That's the second point. The third point I'd like to make is that I think it's important that we try to mobilize a wider group of states who are not involved in the nuclear security summits process to help in addressing this challenge. Some of the states not involved in the summit process could help through ratification of important international instruments, could help to get some of those instruments entered into force. Iaea Arguello, who's obviously been a crucial figure in developing today's conference and in the Latin American Leadership Network, in a recent presentation to an EU consortium conference on nuclear risks, pointed out correctly that if 22 countries in the Latin American and Caribbean region were to ratify the amendment to the Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, that would be enough to get that instrument entered into force. And so there's an indication, I think, that countries who are not involved directly in the summit process, and some of them in this region, could be doing useful things, and that's a deliverable that could be worked on now. It's something that could be progressed now. So that's my third point. My fourth point is actually that I think it seems to me, as somebody who periodically dips in and out of the nuclear security materials debate, that one of the challenges is that far too many countries in the world consider this to be not their problem. Far too many countries in the world have other issues which, frankly, are higher up their list of national security priorities and concerns that they're worried about. And this is for understandable reasons. States face all kinds of difficult challenges. But nonetheless, if one wants a system, a global system, which is comprehensive and universal, then we have to think about ways of mobilizing a larger number of countries to think about this as their problem. And here I think the challenge is not really related to the summit process. I wouldn't recommend that we try and broaden out the summit agendas enormously to cover the other issues, but the political framing of the issue, it seems to me, is extremely important. So, for example, a detonation of a single nuclear device, a bomb, as opposed to a dirty bomb, although perhaps either, would have enormous global consequences, it seems to me, economically. I mean, imagine a scenario in which a terrorist group detonates one bomb. It's highly unlikely that that terrorist group would not immediately follow that detonation with at least a claim that it had access to more than one weapon. The level of panic and chaos that would cause globally would be extraordinary. Even if we were looking at a situation of a very serious dirty bomb in a city like New York, you could be talking about huge economic dislocation and panic. Now, I think right down the food chain of the international economy, if I can put it in such crude terms, that's going to have major consequences. I don't think we're very explicit about what they are, and I think doing some economic modeling about what the effects of these kinds of incidents could be a useful way of taking this issue and explaining to many others around the world why this is their issue, that this is not just an issue for a United States or a United Kingdom that might feel like it's in the front line of threats from terrorism. Secondly, I think there's an issue around the environmental impacts of any kind of major nuclear security incident. Here, the Fukushima accident in Japan, I think, is important. It led to, as we know, a whole change of policy in many countries. Germany, for example, decided to get out of the nuclear power business altogether. That has had a direct impact on the European Union's capability to deliver on its CO2 emissions reductions targets, because the use of nuclear was an important element of the mix for achieving climate change targets. Now, there are around the world right now, according to the World Nuclear Association, some 71 civil nuclear plants under construction, a further 174 already planned, and at the point at which construction will begin soon, and another 301 with concrete proposals on the table which are being considered. Some of you will have, I think, seen with relief that the US and Chinese governments came to an agreement on climate change targets in the last week, and that was terrific. But the same institute in China, which helped the Chinese government to arrive at its new strategy, has also just announced that a very large number of additional nuclear power plants will need to be built in China over and above, I think it's the 27 or 28, which are currently being built there, if China is to meet that climate change reduction target. Now, I mention all these points because I think if you get a very serious nuclear security incident, something even on a larger scale than Fukushima in terms of its effect, you could see a very strong popular backlash against all things nuclear. And if that happens, whether one is in favor of nuclear power or not, the fact is many countries around the world have factored civil nuclear power into their carbon emissions reductions targets. And if a consequence of this kind of incident were to impact that strategy, we could be facing a really major challenge to our ability to limit climate change to under 2 degrees Celsius. Now, this is just a way of illustrating that there are ways of framing this problem into territory which make it clear to everybody that this is a global challenge with global consequences and ramifications, and in which everybody needs to get engaged. So that's my fourth point. We need to do, I think, some reframing of this politically. And my final point relates to the 85% of material in military or non-civilian use, as Joan pointed out earlier. Some months ago, drawing on the work of Joan and her colleagues at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, 5 members of the European Leadership Network published an opinion piece calling for action on this 85%. The signatories of that statement were former French Defence Minister Paul Quillez, former UK Foreign and Defence Minister Sir Malcolm Rifkind, former UK Defence Secretary Des Brown, who's with us at the conference today, General Bernard Norland from France, who's also with us at the conference today, and former French Defence Minister Hervé Morin. These are all highly credible people, and they acknowledged the danger that comes in regard to the 85% of materials not in civil use but in the military sector. And in their op-ed piece, they challenged the assumption that materials in the military sector are somehow by definition more secure than materials in the civil sector. And I'd just like to read you a couple of sentences from their op-ed to illustrate that point. They said, if the United States could mistakenly fly 6 nuclear weapons cross-country, have missile launch officers fall asleep on the job with the doors to launch control facilities propped open, and allow an 85-year-old nun to successfully cut through 4 layers of fencing and deface a national storage vault for highly enriched uranium, surely there is reason to be concerned. Obviously, I would echo that statement, but one of the important things in this op-ed is that they suggest that, to Joan's point about states taking measures to reassure each other, taking demonstrable steps that they can use to reassure each other about their own nuclear security practices, these former ministers and military officials called for the UK, France, and the United States to work together to lead, to create some kind of assurance mechanism where they work with each other to demonstrate to each other their practices in this area. This is obviously a highly sensitive area because people are worried about sharing or losing state secrets, effectively, in this area. So having countries, those 3 countries that are in the NATO alliance and work together closely politically on a whole range of issues, try to forge some mechanisms in this space to demonstrate that it can be done, is a useful proposal. And I think, again, it's something we can be working on and pursuing now. So I agree with everything that Joan said. These are just some additional points, I think, which one could take into consideration over and above what she said. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I love it when people agree with everything I said. Thank you very much. We'll turn now to Rhonda Evans.
In the words of my countryman, Gareth Evans, I'm going to speak to you from the bottom of the mountain, which is in effect the nuclear security work of the agency. And not only am I speaking to you from the bottom of the mountain, but because my director, Kamama Abbott, unfortunately could not be with you, I'm also speaking to you as someone who is at the coalface of putting into practice and assisting states understand nuclear security as a senior nuclear security officer within our division. What I was asked to share with you was the IAEA's nuclear security program, and my own take on that is to reflect on the importance of effective implementation of the existing international legal instruments that we have related to nuclear security. Because one of the key issues that we're looking at is the creation of sustainable national nuclear security regimes throughout our member states. But I was also asked to focus on areas where we could find an improvement in the implementation of that system. And just by way of background, the IAEA currently has 162 member states. And following the endorsement of the Board of Governors and General Conference, we expect 3 more once their legal instruments have been deposited with us. So in my role, I literally travel from Egypt to Burkina Faso, to Angola, to Myanmar, to the Philippines, to Fiji, and trying to work with all of these member states to actually address some of the issues that my fellow panellists have been talking about how you capture the attention at the political level, at the institutional and organisational level about the importance of nuclear security. So what is the IAEA's nuclear security program? This is a slide we commonly use to depict what the description rather than the definition of nuclear security is. And this is described in the Nuclear Security Fundamentals document, which sits at the top of our hierarchy of guidance. So it's the prevention, the detection, and the response to criminal or intentional unauthorised acts involving or directed at nuclear material, other radioactive material, their associated facilities and associated activities. This work is around addressing the actions of non-state actors. Nuclear security is fundamentally part of a state's nuclear security, national security regime, rather. And I guess to address one of the issues that Ian was talking about, in my work with member states, when I have the competent authorities in the room for a workshop on nuclear security, I am indeed talking to national security and intelligence service officers, to customs and border protection, to regulatory authorities, and often to senior officials, representatives of ministries and departments who want to understand the importance of the nuclear security program. This, I thought, was another way of depicting it. My eminent cartoonist and nuclear law expert Carlton Stoiber often comes up with pictures to illustrate what we're talking about. And the main part of our work is actually about the chap on, I guess you're right, the adversary, the unauthorised person who wants to undertake activities to cause harm. Because the objective of nuclear security, similar to the objective of nuclear safety, is to protect the health and safety of people, to protect the environment, to protect society from the harmful effects of a nuclear security event. And that's uppermost in our guidance and our work with member states. So the vision for nuclear security as promulgated by the agency is to achieve worldwide effective security, wherever nuclear or other radioactive material is in use, storage and/or transport. And it's very important, I think, and it has been recognised in many international fora, that the Iaea has a central role to play for international cooperation and assistance in this very important area. We have had a succession of nuclear security plans commencing in 2002, which basically divide our work up into key program elements. Now, this program is endorsed by the policy organs of the Iaea, for instance, the Board of Governors and the General Conference each year, which is then implemented by our division. So what are the main objectives? We've heard some discussions today about the international legal framework for nuclear security, and the role of the agency is to facilitate states' adherence to that international legal framework, those instruments which provide the underpinnings for the nuclear security regime. Our work is always done upon the request of the member states. We don't have the same role as the Safeguards Department, for instance. We are not the super regulator of nuclear security, because states understand and accept and indeed tell us it is their sovereign responsibility to implement nuclear security. So our actions are always at their request, but we have a very structured program, because not only do we want to assist states establish their nuclear security regimes nationally, but we want it to be sustainable, that is, effective over time. We have, and I'll put them all up, and then I'll discuss a few of them, because I think that some of the comments that have been made on this panel, it's worth us addressing in terms of the key modalities that the Iaea is using. We've heard mention of the desirability of international standards for nuclear security, and this is quite a complex and vexed issue, particularly when states say to us, we want your guidance on nuclear security, but you do not mandate standards for us in nuclear security. But we have now developed a very comprehensive guidance series, as I mentioned, with fundamentals at the top, 3 recommendations, documents, and a set of implementing guides to give key guidance to member states about best practice in implementing their national nuclear security regime. And this is at every level, from the legislative and regulatory framework, the key institutions and organisations, and the specific systems and measures that you need to put in place to protect and secure, to detect and to respond. And just very quickly, my panel member Ian mentioned the fact that, for instance, if a dirty bomb were exploded, how do you how do you describe the impact to states? How do you get political leaders to take this seriously? Well, quite recently, in fact, the Moroccans hosted what we call a Convex 3 exercise. It is an emergency response exercise, but for the first time we had a scenario which was a nuclear security event, the explosion of a dirty bomb in a major port in Morocco. Now, the reason that this exercise was so fundamentally important is it tested both the IAEA's response system as well as the member states, and it drew very specific attention to the implications of such a nuclear security event. And Morocco has shared the lessons learned and shared the outcomes of that exercise with a very large number of other member states, including at a recent competent authorities meeting for those emergency response organisations within a state. So we are working very hard to make sure that the member states understand the impact and the importance of nuclear security. We have some modalities which are probably more directed at states with developing and emerging nuclear security regimes. And what we're trying to focus on as well is that the mature countries actively request peer review missions and other important components to demonstrate to others the effectiveness and the impact of their nuclear security systems. So, very quickly, the issues and challenges before I wrap up. The IAEA convened an international ministerial conference on nuclear security in 2013. And the ministers present there, I beg your pardon, made a declaration about nuclear security. And whilst they recognised the achievements that have been made, they also strongly acknowledged that more needs to be done to strengthen nuclear security worldwide. And indeed, I apologise for the length of the next slide, but the key issue is what our Director General Amano had to say on the occasion of the latest Nuclear Security Summit. He acknowledged the progress that had been made in nuclear security. He acknowledged the commitment of global leaders to this important issue. However, he also noted that there is still nuclear material that goes missing. There are still facilities that are inadequately protected, and there isn't, in all places, very effective border security. And the threat of nuclear terrorism does remain real. So he was saying, keep your eye on this, keep working with us. So, two things really I'd like to bring to your attention in conclusion. It is of fundamental importance to the International Atomic Energy Agency that the amendment to the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material enters into force, and that the expansion of its scope to include physical protection measures for nuclear material in domestic use and transport and nuclear facilities becomes realised. The other future improvement is the establishment of truly comprehensive national nuclear security regimes in each state, that there is increased cooperation and assistance among states, and that the IAEA is in a position to continue to meet the demand for its services and assistance. So here's the important issue. Whilst there continues to be a dialogue internationally in relation to the adequacy of the existing international legal framework, I think what's really important is that we implement the framework that exists. And in particular, that's the entry into force of the amendment to the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material. This is and remains a priority for the IAEA. And the program of the agency, the central role of the agency, should also be continued to be recognised to assist states put in place effective and sustainable national nuclear security regimes in order to have an overall effective global nuclear security regime. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rhonda. We'll turn now to Gustavo Einschel.
Buenas tardes, muchísimas gracias, Joan. El hecho de que ya hayan transcurrido 3 cumbres de seguridad nuclear nos brinda bastantes elementos de juicio como para poder hacer una evaluación de cuáles son los progresos, cuáles son las experiencias que hemos adquirido y cuáles son los desafíos que tenemos por delante. Quizás como primer logro podemos destacar que las cumbres de seguridad nuclear le han dado una gran visibilidad a la cuestión, la presencia de jefes de Estado discutiendo estas importantes cuestiones, considerando medidas en común para tomar, sin duda ha elevado la visibilidad de este tipo de agenda. También las cumbres han colaborado a dar una visión general del tema, a consolidar la noción de la llamada arquitectura de seguridad nuclear, que comprende tanto los instrumentos legales a los que se hacía referencia, como el trabajo institucional del Organismo Internacional de Energía Atómica, también la tarea de Naciones Unidas, incluyendo el Consejo de Seguridad a través del seguimiento de la Resolución 1540, y finalmente el trabajo de otras iniciativas que se ocupan de temas similares o conexos, como la iniciativa mundial para combatir el terrorismo nuclear o el Partenariado Mundial sobre Armas de Destrucción en Masa. También otra contribución importante es que tradicionalmente en todos los instrumentos se ponía el énfasis en que la seguridad nuclear era una responsabilidad primariamente de tipo nacional, y a través de este tipo de procesos como la cumbre se había venido destacando mucho más el componente de cooperación internacional, la importancia de que los estados intercambien experiencias y puedan mejorar su propia performance en base a compartir buenas prácticas con otros países. Todo esto sin duda también ha dado un impacto en profundizar el trabajo muy importante que se venía desarrollando en el Organismo Internacional de Energía Atómica. La aparición de las cumbres también logró reacomodar los mandatos de otras iniciativas que venían operando. Las dos que yo mencioné, el Partenariado Global sobre Armas de Destrucción en Masa, que es una proyección de un grupo que trabajaba en el marco del G8, ha cambiado sus mandatos, los ha ampliado para poder trabajar mucho más con el tema de seguridad nuclear y no tanto con el tema de no proliferación tradicional. Y la Iniciativa Mundial para Combatir el Terrorismo Nuclear que mencioné cambió también su mandato, dejó la tarea, digamos, de debate de alto nivel para las cumbres y empezó a desarrollar grupos de trabajo muy concretos, con mandatos específicos para poder desarrollar estándares. Todo esto contribuyó a que hubiera una mayor comprensión de la cuestión de seguridad nuclear como la otra cara de la no proliferación tradicional. Por la no proliferación tradicional la preocupación era que estados adquirieran armas nucleares, y aquí la preocupación es que grupos no estatales, terroristas, crimen organizado, puedan acceder a este tipo de armas. Quizás el impacto político más trascendente, quizás el menos remarcado o reconocido, está en la membresía de las cumbres de seguridad nuclear. En el esquema tradicional de no proliferación, el elemento decisivo era el ser parte del Tratado de No Proliferación Nuclear. Y los tres países que no eran parte del Tratado de No Proliferación Nuclear, India, Pakistán e Israel, estaban excluidos de cualquier debate de no proliferación. El asumir como prioridad el tema de la seguridad nuclear lleva a replantear también los asociados de esa perspectiva. Y siendo el problema evitar el acceso de grupos no estatales a este tipo de materiales, India, Pakistán e Israel forman parte del proceso. Hay un círculo en el esquema mundial que los incorpora cuando tradicionalmente eran los excluidos. La paradoja es que entre los 50 miembros que siguen el proceso están 3 estados poseedores de armas nucleares que están fuera del TNP, y hay muchos países con un récord pacífico muy claro que no forman parte. En lo también formal operativo, el proceso agregó un informe más a los países para cumplir, que al principio era una cuestión voluntaria, pero que es importante porque todos los países lo hemos aceptado, y que permite, como digo, ir más allá del marco de cada uno de estos componentes de la arquitectura de la seguridad nuclear y hacer un informe general sobre cómo el país se compromete en un marco más amplio, ya no solamente vía el Iaea o solamente el Consejo de Seguridad. También está la figura bastante novedosa de los compromisos adicionales a través de las llamadas canastas o baskets, que permiten que los estados profundicen sus obligaciones en algunos campos. Desde el punto de vista de la sustancia, el proceso de las cumbres puso énfasis en elementos más novedosos o menos conocidos de la temática de seguridad nuclear. Los temas tradicionales eran la custodia de los materiales nucleares, la custodia de las fuentes radiactivas, las sinergias entre seguridad tecnológica y seguridad física, la seguridad del transporte. Y en las cumbres se agregan nueva énfasis en otras cuestiones, por ejemplo, la relación con Interpol, que era una cuestión que estaba muy perdida, pasa a ocupar un lugar central. Y todos los esfuerzos que hace Interpol en materia de no proliferación y terrorismo en las 4 variantes de armas de destrucción en masa: química, biológica, radiológica y nuclear. La cuestión de la forénsica nuclear, que es un tema muy importante, que también es casi una novedad, poder contar con registros de material nuclear que permitan, en caso de detectarse un tráfico de materiales, trazar el origen de ese material. Sin un banco de forénsica que permita comparar, es imposible detectar el origen de ese material, que puede ser parte de un tráfico ilegal hacia grupos no estatales. La cultura de la seguridad nuclear, la seguridad de la información, una serie de temas que no estaban tan centrales en la agenda previa de seguridad nuclear y que a través de las cumbres pasaron a ocupar un lugar equivalente. Si hacemos un comentario fuera estricto del ámbito nuclear, toda esta reflexión de seguridad nuclear ya empieza a plantearse aplicado a la seguridad química. En el marco de la Convención de Armas Químicas ya hay todo un debate de cómo prevenir el uso de las sustancias químicas por parte de actores no estatales, en un proceso que recién empieza, que todos tenemos una experiencia previa que venimos tomando de lo nuclear, pero que sin embargo va a tener muchos más desafíos porque lo químico está mucho más difundido, hay mucho más involucramiento privado, está mucho más disperso en la industria. La gran duda del proceso hacia el futuro es cómo continúa. Uno puede imaginar que determinados debates internacionales se dan por una vitalidad propia de la cuestión que mueve al consenso a toda la amplia comunidad de estados, o como se buscó en este caso, un grupo más reducido de países que tome el liderazgo y que le da impulso a la cuestión. Ese no es un tema menor, eso no es un tema menor y voy a volver sobre él un poco más adelante. La segunda cuestión es que hasta ahora gran parte de la construcción de la agenda es reagrupar esfuerzos que se venían realizando en diferentes ámbitos, tratar de presentarlos de una manera homogénea y, en caso de duda, ir al mínimo común denominador. Eso es muy común en los procesos multilaterales y hasta ahora nos ha permitido más o menos reagrupar y darle una cierta forma a la agenda de seguridad nuclear. Un tema que permanece y que se trata de acomodar siempre es cómo podemos estandarizar un proceso como es de seguridad nuclear que en cada caso, en cada país, está basado en la evaluación de seguridad o de amenaza que cada país realiza. Hay otras disciplinas en lo nuclear, por ejemplo, la seguridad radiológica, en la cual están definidos que para proteger a las personas o al medio ambiente de determinado tipo de materiales hay pautas científicas, determinados espesores, protecciones, medidas. En el caso de la seguridad nuclear, el terrorismo nuclear, se parte de una amenaza de base que cada país evalúa. Entonces es muy difícil estandarizar, en algunos casos, determinados parámetros. Para un país, por ejemplo, que considera que tiene una alta amenaza porque su involucramiento global o la presencia de materiales o lo que sea lo lleva a estar más expuesto, y un país que puede estar más en la periferia geográfica, tiene menos material y que a lo mejor puede considerar que determinados estándares son excesivos. La clave, y ya un poquito lo dije antes, me parece es cómo universalizamos los logros de un proceso que solamente involucra a 50 países. Cada uno de estos pasos que yo fui mencionando, que en la evaluación de la Argentina son pasos muy positivos, esta visión general es compartida por 50 países. Y los estándares se van profundizando en una dirección. Mientras tanto, el Iaea, que es el organismo natural, sigue trabajando, pero hay una diferencia. Si comparamos, por ejemplo, el documento final de la reunión ministerial del 2013 con los documentos de la cumbre, no es el caso en Argentina, pero algunos países hicieron una comparación muy crítica, que por supuesto los documentos de la cumbre son mucho más profundos, mucho más precisos, y que el documento general que fue aprobado en esa reunión de la Iaea tiene un carácter más general. Pero sin embargo, pese a su carácter más general, tiene el enorme valor de que fue consensuado por más de 150 países. de una manera o la otra tengamos una visión más positiva o más negativa, se están produciendo como dos niveles de estándares. Y esto es muy complicado y me lleva a pensar que quizás el desafío más grande que tenemos por delante no está tanto en la sustancia, no está tanto en el establecimiento de estándares, sino en cómo trasvasar lo que se va logrando en algunos ámbitos al ámbito más grande. Es como una teoría del péndulo, ¿no? Los grupos que trabajan de número reducido son muy eficientes, pero tienen el problema, mayor eficiencia, más dificultad para explicárselo a todos los demás que no estuvieron en la elaboración de las normas. Si uno en el otro extremo trabaja con toda la totalidad de la comunidad, se es menos eficiente en el uso del tiempo y se avanza de manera más lenta. Siempre encontró, es un punto de equilibrio. Este comentario que hago sobre la universalización me parece que se ha hecho un poco más serio o tiene consecuencias más importantes después de la última cumbre en La Haya. ¿Por qué digo esto? Tradicionalmente, cuando hablábamos de materiales a ser protegidos en el marco de la cumbre, nos referíamos principalmente al material nuclear empleado en armas nucleares y al material nuclear en los programas de los países de usos pacíficos. Y en menor medida nos referíamos a la tercera categoría, que era el material radiológico, susceptible de ser usado para contaminar el ambiente o con una bomba sucia combinado con un explosivo convencional. Ese delicado balance entre las tres fuentes de riesgo, y digamos, no quiero dejar pasar que, por supuesto, para nosotros el principal riesgo lo constituyen los arsenales nucleares, pero eso está acotado a un grupo reducido de países. Este balance, no digo que se rompió, pero tomó otra perspectiva, porque, como seguramente ustedes saben, durante la cumbre se eligió un escenario para presentar a los líderes, a través de una serie de videos que implicaban el desarrollo de un incidente, y se iba planteando con un sistema muy fácil de manejar y muy simpático de computadoras, que los jefes de Estado pudieran ir dando sus opciones cómo resolver ese incidente. Bueno, el incidente que se planteó fue el incidente de sustracción de una fuente radiológica. Entonces, si estábamos en el proceso de pensar solamente en armas nucleares o de materiales nucleares, bueno, un número de 50 países, más o menos los países que estaban ahí en el proceso, son los que tienen o armas nucleares o materiales nucleares. Pero si expandimos el ejercicio a considerar las bombas de cobalto de los hospitales, ya afectan prácticamente a todos a los países del mundo. Entonces, es mucho más difícil imaginarnos un proceso de generar estándares o parámetros entre 50 para algo que en la cosa cotidiana, en el day by day, va a afectarlos a todos. Quizás esa es la perspectiva nuestra, el problema mayor. El tema de las armas nucleares, siempre se va a encontrar un lenguaje para reflejar adecuadamente la preocupación, pero el problema es procesal. Nosotros tomamos con debida nota y vemos de manera muy positiva las 5 prioridades que fueron presentadas en un evento paralelo a la primera reunión de Sherpas en Washington y que fueron presentadas en esta reunión por Joan al principio. Y como último comentario, tuvimos una primera reunión de Sherpas después de la cumbre. La reunión fue hace 2 o 3 semanas en Washington. Y en líneas generales, todavía el dilema sigue sin solucionar, porque estamos explorando maneras de trabajar en la sustancia, pero la forma en que esa sustancia se va a poder canalizar en los diferentes foros donde se trata la cuestión, universales, para lograr la aceptación del resto de la comunidad internacional, es un poco más complejo. Cuesta pensar que un ejercicio de tanta sofisticación y con tanto esfuerzo pueda simplemente plasmarse en que en el Iaea o en Naciones Unidas o en Interpol, un grupo de 50 países simplemente presentemos una resolución encomiando determinados comportamientos. Ya si fuera solamente eso, habría un proceso sofisticado de lograr adhesiones. A la Argentina le parece que todos los países que participamos en este proceso o que estamos comprometidos con la temática, tenemos la obligación de tratar de explicar nuestra preocupación a otros países que quizás por sus circunstancias nacionales no lo pueden ver así. En ese contexto nosotros valoramos muy especialmente el trabajo que se hace en la Iniciativa Mundial para Combatir el Terrorismo Nuclear, que también es un club, pero solamente tiene, digamos, en vez de tener 50 miembros, tiene casi 90, con lo cual aproxima bastante más a la membresía de los órganos del Iaea, y que puede servir como una cámara de transferencia para discutir las ideas en un ambiente más técnico, para relajar los espíritus en el sentido de que no va a haber ningún grupo que le quiera imponer sus ideas a otro. Y en el marco de esta iniciativa, Argentina organizó en la primera semana de agosto con Chile, acá en Buenos Aires, un ejercicio, un REMEX, un ejercicio de emergencia radiológica. El ejercicio se denominó Paiwen, que consistía en imaginar, lo hizo Argentina con Chile y había representantes de más de 30 países asistiendo al ejercicio como observadores e hicieron una especie de ejercicio paralelo después. Consistía también, un poco replicando lo que vimos en La Haya, en imaginar robos simultáneos de fuentes radiológicas a ambos lados de la frontera, en una zona cercana, y cómo reaccionarían las fuerzas de seguridad, de inteligencia, de policía en ambos casos, si habría coordinación, no habría coordinación, cómo operarían los protocolos nacionales. Argentina es un país federal, tenemos las autoridades federales, las autoridades provinciales, las autoridades locales, salud, etcétera. Y un poco la idea fue, invitando a otros países de América Latina, explicar de una manera que no pretende ser condescendiente ni mucho menos, pero tratar de compartir la experiencia de que la sustracción de una fuente le puede pasar a cualquiera, y que el uso de esa fuente por actores terroristas, si la fuente desaparece, es una posibilidad real, y que nadie esté exento de que le suceda una cosa así. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. We have time now, about 20 minutes, to open the floor to questions that you may have. And I see we have some microphones on the floor as well, so I'll ask you to raise your hand, please, and we'll call on you in turn. Yes.
Buenas tardes, gracias. Yo soy Elida Bustos de la revista Latin Trade. La pregunta para el panel, un poco enganchada en lo que el embajador Aichil acaba de decir. ¿En qué situación se está en estos momentos respecto del contrabando de material radioactivo? Porque cada tanto salen los diarios que que se encontró algo que sale de los ex países de la Unión Soviética, de las ex repúblicas soviéticas. ¿Cuál es la situación hoy? En relación con hace unos años, ¿se estabilizó, hay menos, aumentó? No solamente el peligro hipotético, sino lo que realmente se está encontrando en estos momentos en distintos lugares. Gracias.
Thank you. Let me ask Rhonda if you want to offer any response on the question about radiological sources.
Sure. As some of you may be aware, the IAEA maintains what's called an incident and trafficking database. It's a voluntary reporting mechanism that countries around the world can report any incident of unauthorized possession, theft, or movement, unauthorized movement of sources. The reports are made to the incident and trafficking database, and then they are subsequently confirmed. Now, of course, this isn't a complete record because not every country reports these. But you might be interested to know that in analytical reports that have been done by the agency, 50% of those reports concern radioactive material which is not nuclear material. There are also a large number of reports of contaminated scrap metal. So the vast majority of reports actually concern radiological material or other radioactive material. And a very much smaller number concern nuclear material. The thing that you would have to say about that is that that could also be related to the detection capabilities in countries as well. It's much harder to detect nuclear material using some of the detection capabilities that countries have. But just based on raw figures and the reports that we receive, there is a very large number of radioactive sources which are actually detected through being trafficked, or indeed in the next case also through contaminating scrap metal. So does that answer your question? It's obviously not a complete record because of course not every country reports those to the agency.
I would just add to that at the 2014 summit in The Hague, a number of countries came together in a joint commitment to try and secure all of their so-called Category 1 radiological sources, so sources using the most dangerous materials, of which there are thousands. And Gustavo, you may recall the number of states, between 1 and 2 dozen, I think, who signed on to that. But this is a very promising sign.
Un número importante de países en la cumbre se sumaron a una canasta especial de compromisos en esto. El punto esencial acá es que adquirir conciencia del riesgo. En la medida que los países no adquieran conciencia de que eso puede representar un riesgo de seguridad y no solamente un riesgo accidental para la salud, que puede haber un uso voluntario, malicioso de la fuente, en la medida que no se produzca esa conciencia, es muy difícil prevenir los incidentes. En la pregunta se hacía referencia a fuentes que podían venir de caídas de ciertos regímenes. Eso es, digamos, como un legado histórico que hay que manejar. Pero las fuentes tienen un nivel de decaimiento, no duran para siempre. El problema es la sustracción de fuentes que están operativas en los hospitales. Entonces, cada país tiene la responsabilidad de hacer su inventario y de instrumentar las medidas que sean necesarias para poder hacer el seguimiento de esa fuente, de cómo se usa, cómo se transporta. Si el país no tiene conocimientos, hay cooperación internacional, está la labor del Organismo Internacional de Energía Atómica, hay fuentes de cooperación bilateral. Pero en la medida, una cosa muy común hasta hace unos años, se terminaba de usar la fuente no servía más para usos médicos, pero todavía contaminaba, y la fuente se deja en un contenedor aislante en la parte de atrás del hospital, afuera, en la calle, para que vengan después a juntarlo. Entonces, cualquier persona que se lleve esa fuente y abra, si es un accidente se puede enfermar contaminado, pero un grupo que se lleve esa fuente y sepa encontrar la manera, que no es muy difícil, de generar un atentado, ya simplemente el anuncio a la opinión pública de que una fuente ha estado expuesta fuera de un concierto de rock o fuera de un espectáculo deportivo o en un parque público, solamente el anuncio ya, desde el punto de vista de un ataque terrorista, causaría un caos enorme, sin llegar a la explosión. O sea, se puede hacer muchísimo daño con muy poco. Entonces, el compromiso de cada Estado de proteger sus fuentes cierra la posibilidad de este tipo de incidentes.
Rhonda, you wanted to add to this.
Yes, thank you. That was also a very good lead-in to one of the non-binding legal instruments under the auspices of the Iaea, which is the Code of Conduct on the Safety and Security of Radioactive Sources, for which there are about 100 member states who have given political commitment. And it is essentially about making sure that radioactive sources are not only safe from a radiation protection point of view, but also secure from the point of view of not causing harm, either through loss or theft or misplacement, or indeed because in some countries they were never under regulatory control in the first place. So that's another very important element in your nuclear security national system, because most countries that I visit don't have nuclear material or nuclear facilities, but they have a very, very large use of radioactive sources, including the Category 1 and Category 2, which we're most concerned about. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a question right down here on the first row. Alvaro.
Thank
and
you.
please introduce yourself, if you would.
My name is Alvaro Bermudez. I'm part of the Latin American and Caribbean Leadership Network. You know, I have 3 subjects. One is this 85% that you explained very good, but I would like to hear a little bit more, especially for countries like my country, Uruguay, that I think that our problem would be the thousands of sources we have, radiological sources, but could be one of these countries that could feel that it's very safe, and it is not. We really have a lot of problems in the border many times. We know that. But we must be aware of this 85% for sure. And then if you can explain us much more how it is possible to control to be transparent to the other states that don't have this kind of radiological material or fuel or whatever. The other point is the real possibility of introducing more countries in the next summits, especially because of what we were discussing today, that was the different proposals that sometimes need some agreements between different countries, and then there are pre-agreements, and then some proposals will be much more well received than others. So I follow the position of Gustavo that I think is better if you have much more Latin American countries, so to say, because we are here, but I think it's the same problem all abroad. And the third is the point that we were talking about the possibility in the 2016 to really have some kind of standards that really can be used all around the world. Because I think that the issue is very complicated, and as you very good expose, there are different positions for different countries. So you must look for one way that could give, could catch the interest of other countries that are not so in the issue to enter in this kind of standards. And you know that for many countries, it will be necessary to give a lot of help and a lot of entrainment and a lot of equipment. You know, it is like that. Usually it's like that. So it will be, after the summit, a long work to do. So must be some kind of committee, some kind of work of the Iaea, for sure. The agency always is working for all of us. And then 3 points that maybe you can give something more for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me try and tackle the first of the 3 questions and then turn to colleagues to help with the others and to add to the first if they'd like. On the question of the 85% and how can we succeed in achieving transparency over these materials within the states that have them, I would reflect back on a really fundamental statement or observation that Ian made, which is that we're really fundamentally lacking the political will to do something about these materials and in the countries that hold them. I would observe that all of us here today, whether we are citizens of countries that have military materials or citizens of countries that do not, we need to help make the case for why it's essential to include this 85% to strengthen the security around those materials and find ways to build some transparency mechanisms and confidence around the status of those materials. A number of my colleagues in the US government who are working on the Nuclear Security Summit have said, we need help making the case for why military materials security is so essential. They have been working to lead this effort, and the British have joined with them in supporting some initiative on military materials, but they're having a tough time garnering support from any other nation with these materials in the context of the summit. And they keep saying, please help us make the case. We, the US, and we, Britain, cannot be the only ones who recognize that this is important. So I think we can all play a role there in helping to to build the political will. I would just add one small footnote that the Nuclear Threat Initiative has just launched a study group of eminent experts and former political leaders representing states or from states that have these military materials to try and develop a set of recommendations for how states can tackle the very question that you raised. How can they both strengthen security and bring about greater transparency? And we have in the audience Desmond Brown, who is one of the co-chairs of that study group and invite you all to ask him more about it, but we're hoping within about 6 months that study group will not only help make the case, but come out with concrete recommendations that summit states can consider for implementation. Let me turn to our other panelists and ask if anybody else, maybe, I'd be curious to hear views on both the standards question and also the universality question. How do we introduce more states to the summit? There might be a flip way to ask that question too, since the summit process is ending. Is there a way we can get IAEA states more engaged in adhering to some of the commitments that were started in the context of the summit? And to that end, Rhonda, maybe you can say a little bit about the INFCIRC, the information circular process at the IAEA, because I'm aware of one very encouraging development, and that is that there was a critical commitment made by a group of 30-plus states at the summit to strengthening materials security through a range of different steps. And even though that commitment, it manifested itself in a joint statement signed by these 30, I think it was 35 countries, even though that emerged out of the Nuclear Security Summit, it was introduced to the IAEA as an information circular, so it's available now to all states. And it is possible for any IAEA member state to join in to signal its support for that commitment. So I think there are ways to bring these processes together and help universalize, but would be curious to hear from Rhonda, her views.
Sure, and really my views are not my personal view, but the manner in which the agency, of course, would take any of these matters forward is through its two main policy organs, the Board of Governors and the member states through the General Conference process. And I think that it will be very interesting to see what our member states and what our Board of Governors give us as new directions coming out of these very active high-level dialogues that have gone on internationally. Although you probably didn't have time to read the slide, in his statement at the last Nuclear Security Summit, our Director General, of course, was very encouraged by the focus on the role of the IAEA in its central coordination for nuclear security assistance. The issue, in addition, of universalisation and standards, again, will become a policy matter for our member states and our Board of Governors. At the moment, you'd be aware that there is always a clear distinction made between our Safety Standards Series and our Nuclear Security Guidance Series, which I don't think undermines the guidance contained in it if a state actually incorporates it into its national system. But rather, our member states are very clear that they draw a distinction between the notion of a standard from the Safety Standards Series and Nuclear Security Series guidance, because I think the fundamental premise that nuclear security is a sovereign responsibility is one that's held very, very close. But the issue of universalisation is an interesting one because I work with such a very large range of member states. And I think it's very true to say that the difficulty with a concept of universalisation are the very large cultural, institutional and historical differences between states and the manner in which they approach some of these issues. So whilst you can give guidance on methodology or issues to consider, you'll never end up with exactly the same threat assessment or approach to risk reduction or indeed what is a tolerable level of risk in a particular country. So I think some of the interesting debates into the future is how we work toward a system which means that we reduce the risk of material coming out of regulatory control to a very acceptable level, which goes back to the gentleman's question about water detection and the movement of materials, but also recognising that nuclear security, sitting as it does within national security paradigms, is a very interesting topic for member states to come to grips with, and the manner in which they are prepared to share or not their approaches, which comes back to the transparency and accountability issue my colleague from Australia, Mr. Gareth Evans, raised this morning as well. They're really important dialogue to carry on in whichever forum states choose to have that, whether through other summits or indeed through the auspices of the agency. I think it's a very dynamic discussion that we'll have.
Gustavo, and I note we're winding down to our last couple of minutes, so Gustavo, I might also ask that as you comment on this, you maybe offer any final comments, and I'll offer each of our other two panelists an opportunity as well.
Sí, aclarar por supuesto que para nosotros el camino de universalización necesariamente es un camino que conduce al Organismo Internacional de Energía Atómica. Nos parece que la construcción de las cumbres ha dado muchísimo, pero es el momento de que ese aporte se reconduzca en un organismo universal como es el Organismo de Energía Atómica. En esa transferencia se pueden usar muchas herramientas, se pueden usar iniciativas. Yo no mencioné, pero lo quiero hacer ahora, en el caso de nuestra región está el Foro Iberoamericano de Reguladores Nucleares, de Autoridades Reguladoras, que es una herramienta para ir creando conciencia a nivel regional también. Para que todos los diferentes países en el Iaea, que como decía muy bien recién Roda, hay diferentes percepciones, hay que desarrollar, hay que lograr este clic mental, esta toma de conciencia a nivel de las particularidades regionales. Entonces todos los esfuerzos tienen que concluir en llegar a un mínimo o un razonable nivel, como decían recién, pero es un proceso largo donde todas las herramientas tienen que ser usadas, pero como es nuestra opinión que debe ser exclusivamente en el sentido de reforzar el rol del Organismo Internacional de Energía Atómica.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask if Rhonda and Ian, if you have any summary comments you'd like to make after hearing the discussion and before we conclude. Ian.
Just make two brief points. First, on the issue of how we enlarge the summit process to other countries. I was suggesting earlier that one method for extending the countries participating is to identify who you think the really important players are who are not currently there, and then develop the nationally focused political engagement strategy to get them there. Now, in the case of Iran at the moment, for example, there's a very live discussion about what else follows a possible deal with Iran on its nuclear program. For example, it will then be encouraged to play a much more active role in helping to stop the civil war in Syria, etc., etc. So I think there's and that's appealing. That's essentially appealing to the Iranian government's leadership to say a more active international role. You'll be welcomed into a more active international role and be a more influential player if you sign on the dotted line on the nuclear deal. So what I'm suggesting is, deals can be made when you're giving countries that you want at the table, when you give them something else they want and what they need, and we can do some creative thinking about that. The second, more technical fix, I think, is to think about delegation. That certain countries could go from particular regions as delegates for the wider region, or as delegates on behalf of some other groupings of states who share common positions on particular aspects of the challenge. So, and then finally, I just want to say on the relationship, on the issue of this 85% and the lack of political will, I think one of the big barriers is that too many political leaders think that they have to somehow acknowledge weaknesses in their own systems in order to embrace this challenge. And I think what we have to encourage them to do there is to, and this is part of a much wider 21st century sovereignty dialogue in a way, we have to encourage them to say, the threat to our citizens doesn't necessarily come from what we're doing with our materials. It could just be a weakness somewhere else globally. And the only way we can attack that problem is by showing that we are responsible sovereigns and building mutual assurance mechanisms with others so that we can all rely on each other, which is what we have to do in today's globalized environment for our security.
Here. Any final comment, Rhonda?
Just one final comment, and that is that whilst the agency is only observer to the Nuclear Security Summit, it certainly will look with interest at the outcome of the summit, and then it has in fact timed its next international nuclear security conference at the ministerial level to be held in December 2016. And that will be a significant input into the development of the next nuclear security plan going forward from 2018 to 2021 rather. So I think that our Director General and indeed our department heads and division heads are very much looking forward to seeing the influence that that has on the next shape of the next nuclear security plan, taking us into the 20s. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So please join me in thanking all three of our panelists.